My fiancé included his 4 kids in our wedding, but excluded my 5-year-old daughter. When I demanded he include her, he called me manipulative. So I canceled everything and discovered he never saw us as real family. I'm 32 years old. I work in human resources administration. And I need to tell this story because like 2 weeks ago, I called off my wedding, returned the ring, and packed up my daughter's things to leave the house of the man who was going to be my husband. People ask me what happened, because everything seemed perfect from the outside. You know, 2 people with kids finding each other and forming a new family. But the truth is that what happened was so simple and so complicated at the same time that I'm not even sure I've fully processed everything. I guess I should start from the beginning, or at least from when I met David. Like 2.5 years ago on one of those dating apps you use when you already have kids and don't have the time or energy to go out to bars to meet people. David had 4 children, which at first seemed intimidating because I only have Sophie, my 5-year-old daughter, but he assured me he was looking for something serious, that he'd already been through 2 relationships that didn't work out, and this time he wanted to do it right. I was coming from a complicated divorce when Sophie was 2 years old. Her dad basically disappeared after that, like he moved to another state and sees her maybe twice a year if that. So the idea of Sophie having a stable father figure seemed amazing. David seemed so committed to his kids. He talked about them all the time, had pictures of them everywhere, and I thought, this is a good man, a family man. Exactly what Sophie and I need. His kids were from 2 different relationships. He had 7-year-old twin girls with his first ex, a preteen daughter who was 11 with another woman, and a 5-year-old boy, the same age as Sophie, from his most recent relationship. At first, everything was nice. I mean, the typical outings where all the kids ran around the park and we tried to have conversations between screams and fights over the swings. But it felt good, like we were building something real. Sophie, I got excited every time we went to see David and his kids. She's an only child, and I think she liked the idea of having siblings, even if indirectly. We moved in together like a year ago, bought a bigger house so all the kids could have their space. And that's when I started noticing some things I didn't like, but honestly ignored, because I was so invested in the idea of this perfect family I'd built in my head. David was very present with his kids, which obviously was fine, but with Sophie it was different. I can't explain it exactly. It was like more distant, more formal, like she was someone else's daughter living in his house and not part of the family. When his twin girls wanted something, he'd say yes immediately. When Sophie asked for the same thing, he'd look at me like waiting for me to decide. When his 5-year-old son threw a tantrum, David would sit with him and talk to him with all the patience in the world. But when Sophie cried about something, he'd leave me to deal with it. I justified it, thinking, well, it's natural. They're his biological kids. He needs time to connect with Sophie. These things don't happen overnight. Everything exploded like 2 months ago when we started planning the wedding. We'd been talking about getting married since we moved in together, but we wanted to wait for the kids to adjust well to living all under the same roof before taking that step. David was super excited, looking for venues, talking about the guest list, and one day he tells me, I've already decided the kids' roles in the ceremony. My son is going to be the ring bearer, and my 3 daughters are going to be the flower girls. I just sat there processing what he'd just said, because he'd just mentioned 4 of the 5 kids living in our house. You know what I mean? He said nothing about Sophie. I asked him, and what's Sophie going to do? Just like that? Simple? No drama? Just genuine curiosity. Because I thought maybe he'd forgotten to mention her, or had another role in mind for her. David looked at me like I'd asked him the most absurd question in the world, and said, well, 3 flower girls are enough. We don't need 4. I laughed because I thought he was joking, but he was completely serious. I told him, David, Sophie's going to want to participate. She's 5 years old. You can't leave her out while all her siblings are in the ceremony. And he responded, technically they're not her siblings yet, and besides I already made the decision. I don't want it to look crowded with so many kids up front. I didn't want to fight that day because we'd just started planning everything and I thought he'd eventually come to his senses, that he just needed time to think about it better. But like a week later, Sophie was playing in her room and heard the twins talking about being flower girls. She ran downstairs all excited and asked me, Mommy, I'm going to be a flower girl at the wedding too. Right? Can I have a pretty dress like them? My heart broke, right there, because I saw the excitement in her eyes, and I knew what was coming. I told her I was going to talk to David, that of course she was going to participate in the wedding, because it was our family. That night, I waited until all the kids were asleep and told David we needed to talk about Sophie and the wedding. He immediately put on that face he made when he knew he was going to have an uncomfortable conversation, like preparing for battle. I explained that Sophie had heard the twins and was excited about being part of the ceremony, that it was important for her to feel included. David sighed. And it was that kind of sigh that lets you know the person has already made a decision and doesn't care what you say. He told me, "Rebecca, I already explained this to you. 3 flower girls are enough. I'm not going to change the whole plan because your daughter now wants to participate. Your daughter. Not our daughter. Not Sophie. Your daughter." As if we hadn't been living together for a year, as if we weren't about to get married and officially become a family. I told him it wasn't fair. How was he going to explain to Sophie that her 4 siblings were going to be in the wedding but she wasn't, that this was going to make her feel excluded and less important? David got upset and told me I was making this about my kid versus his kids, that I was creating a problem where there wasn't one, that Sophie was too young to understand these things and would forget about it in a few days. But she didn't forget. Sophie asked me every couple days about the wedding, about whether we could go look for her flower girl dress yet. And every time she did, I felt like something broke a little more inside me. I talked to David again like 3 more times over the next 2 weeks. I tried different approaches. I suggested that maybe we could have 4 flower girls and it was no big deal, or that Sophie could have some other special role. Whatever, as long as she felt part of this. Every time he said no, that I was being dramatic, that I was overprotecting Sophie, that she had to learn she couldn't always have everything she wanted. The big fight was on a Friday night. I think it was like 3 weeks after all this started. I came home from work tired. Sophie had had a rough day at preschool because apparently the twins had been telling other kids about the wedding and their dresses, and Sophie came home crying, asking why she wasn't going to have a dress like theirs. I waited for David to get home and told him what had happened, and he literally told me Sophie was being manipulative, that I was encouraging her to create drama. He called me petty, said I was being toxic, and that I was ruining something that should be beautiful with my ridiculous demands. Something in me broke in that moment. I don't know. Like all the little things I'd been ignoring suddenly became impossible to ignore. I yelled at him that it wasn't a ridiculous demand to want my daughter to feel included in our wedding. How could he be so blind not to see that he was treating her differently? That this wasn't about dresses or ceremony roles, but about the fact that he clearly saw Sophie as something separate from his real family. He yelled back that I was crazy, that he treated all the kids equally, that if Sophie felt excluded, it was because I was putting ideas in her head. After that fight, I started observing more carefully how David interacted with Sophie versus how he interacted with his own kids, and the truth is, I don't know how I hadn't seen it before so clearly. When his son spilled something on the table, David would say, "It's okay, champ, accidents happen," and clean it up with a smile. When Sophie spilled something, he'd look at me for me to clean it and talk to her about being more careful. When the twins wanted to stay up late on a Friday, David would make popcorn, and they'd watch a movie together. When Sophie asked for the same thing, he'd say it was bedtime. And rules were rules. It was constant. It was in everything. And I can't believe it took a fight about a wedding to really see it. I started questioning everything. Honestly, I'd lie awake at night thinking, am I really going to marry this man? Am I really going to raise my daughter in an environment where she's clearly second class compared to the other kids? What kind of message am I sending Sophie if I accept this? I tried to talk to David one more time, but this time it wasn't just about the wedding. It was about everything, about how he treated her day to day, about the future, about whether we could really make this work. That conversation was even worse than the previous one. David got defensive immediately, said I was exaggerating, that I was looking for problems where there weren't any, that if I was so unhappy maybe we needed to rethink the whole relationship. And that's when it really hit me, as they say, because he was using the threat of ending the relationship as a way to shut me up, to make me stop advocating for my daughter. I realized that in his head, I had to choose between him and Sophie, between having this family with him or continuing to insist that Sophie be treated as an equal. The straw that broke the camel's back was like 2 days later when we were all having dinner. The twins started talking about their dresses again, completely innocent because they didn't know all the drama behind this, and Sophie sat quiet looking at her plate. After dinner, she helped me wash the dishes, something she normally loves to do because she likes playing with the bubbles, but that night she was serious. She asked me, "Mommy, David doesn't love me, does he? That's why I can't be in the wedding." She was 5 years old. 5 years old, and she was already internalizing that she wasn't important enough to be included. I told her, of course, David loved her, but as I said the words, I realized I wasn't sure they were true, or at least not in the way she needed to be loved. That night, after putting her to bed, I cried. I cried because I'd brought my daughter into this situation thinking I was giving her a family, and what I'd really given her was a place where she felt less than everyone else. I cried because I realized I'd been so desperate to have a complete family that I'd ignored giant red flags for over a year. The next day, I told David we needed to talk, that this was serious, and if we couldn't resolve it, we couldn't get married. We sat in the living room after all the kids went to sleep, and I told him, very clearly, that Sophie needed to be included in the wedding as a flower girl, or we needed to cancel everything and really evaluate whether this relationship could work. I thought that would make him react, that he'd finally understand the gravity of the situation. David looked at me for a long time and then told me he wasn't going to change his plans for the wedding, that he'd already made those decisions and he wasn't going to let me manipulate him with threats to cancel the wedding. When he said, if I really wanted to end the relationship over something as small as this, then maybe I wasn't as committed to the family as I claimed to be. He accused me of prioritizing Sophie over him and his kids, of not being willing to compromise, of creating division instead of unity. That was the clearest night of my life, I think. I realized David was never going to see Sophie as really part of his family, that it was always going to be his kids and then my daughter, that we were never going to be a truly integrated family. And I realized that if I married him anyway, I'd be teaching Sophie it was okay to be treated as less, that her value depended on how much she accommodated what others wanted, that her mom wasn't going to defend her place in the world. I told David he was right, that maybe I wasn't as committed to this family, at least not to the version of family where my daughter was constantly treated differently. I told him the wedding was canceled and Sophie and I were moving out. He got angry, called me dramatic, said I was ruining something good out of pure pride, that I was going to regret it. Maybe I will regret it, I don't know. But what I do know is I wasn't going to regret prioritizing my daughter and her emotional well-being over a relationship that clearly wasn't healthy for her. I packed our things over the next 3 days. David barely spoke to me, like he'd pass by me as if I were invisible. But what was funny is that suddenly he was being super nice to Sophie, like trying to prove something. But it was too late for that. We moved into a small apartment like 15 minutes from there. Nothing fancy, but it's ours, and Sophie has her own room and doesn't have to feel less important than anyone. Like a week after we moved, David showed up at my work. He said we'd had time to calm down and he wanted to talk about fixing things. He asked me to go for coffee and I accepted. Not because I wanted to get back with him, but because I needed to close that chapter properly. We sat in a coffee shop near my office and he started with what sounded like an apology. Said maybe he'd been too rigid about the whole wedding thing, that he understood I wanted Sophie to feel included. For a moment I thought maybe he'd really reflected, that he'd understood why this was so important. But then he kept talking and said, so I thought maybe we can try again. But I need you to stop pushing so hard about this Sophie thing, that you understand I also have kids and needs, and it can't always be about what your daughter wants. That's when I realized he hadn't understood anything. That his version of fixing things was me stopping advocating for my daughter, accepting the secondary place he'd assigned her and all of us pretending that was okay. I told him no, thanks for coming, but there was nothing to fix, that this relationship was over and it was better that way for everyone. He got upset again, said I was impossible, that no man was going to put up with my attitude and my demands, and he left the coffee shop furious. I haven't heard much from him since then. Just some messages asking about things I left at the house and asking me to return the ring, which I did. Sophie asked me a couple times about David and the kids. I told her the truth in an age-appropriate way, that sometimes people don't work out together even when they try hard. That doesn't mean anyone did anything wrong, but simply it wasn't right for us. Last week, Sophie asked me if she was going to have to go back to living with David and his siblings. I told her no, that we were going to stay in our apartment, just the two of us. She thought about it for a moment and then said, "That's okay, Mommy. I like that it's just you and me. You're my favorite person anyway." And I started crying right there. Not from sadness, but from relief, because I realized I'd made the right decision, that defending my daughter and her worth was always going to be more important than any relationship. I don't know what's going to happen now. If I'm going to try to have a serious relationship again, or if I'm going to focus just on Sophie and me for a while. What I do know is that next time I consider bringing someone into our lives, I'm going to be much more attentive to the signs. I'm going to trust my instinct when something doesn't feel right. And I'm never going to prioritize my desire to have a complete family over my daughter's emotional well-being. Sophie deserves to feel loved and valued and prioritized. And if a man can't give her that, then he's not the right man for us. Period. There are still hard days. Honestly, days where I wonder if I was too harsh, if I should have been more patient, if maybe things could have improved with time. But then I see Sophie playing peacefully in her room, without the tension she had when we lived with David. Without that sadness I saw in her eyes when the other kids received attention. She didn't receive, and I know I did the right thing. At the end of the day, my job as a mom isn't to find Sophie a dad. It's to protect her and make sure she grows up knowing she's valuable and loved exactly as she is. And that's what I'm going to keep doing, with or without a partner.